This may be our last discussion of Anyone Got a Match by Max Schulman. Depends on if I think of anything at the last minute next week. But at the moment, I will briefly touch on a couple of things and then mention a bigger thing. I think we've already talked about the major issues. Well, the first brief thing has to do with infidelity, which in this book, as well as most of the literature that I've read from quite a bit of the period, this book being published in 1964, so we'll back it up about 20 years and bump it up by about 10 from there, maybe into the mid 70s. But anyway, the attitude is really different. And strangely, it's a bit reversed from what I think the prevailing cultural narrative would suggest. There is, bluntly, there is an acknowledgement in all of the literature I'm talking about that infidelities occur, and that they occur perhaps against one's better judgment, even against one's potential wishes. It is a very gray topic, and it's acknowledged interiorly, if you will. That occurs in a couple of ways. When I mean interiorly, what does that mean? It means that the characters recognize it as a gray topic, including those who are inclined to be upset about these specific events. And also the events, because you see events in a novel or any kind of story are non-neutral, right? Coincidence is a character in stories. And the idea is that those prevailing events, those things, the way things occur, who bumps into whom, the way information occurs, what plans come to fruition, or what intentions or plans get upset, all those things acting as agency in the story really don't seem to hate infidelity. They don't punish it. It's not like a morality tale or a passion play in which the behavior will cause its own destruction, the destruction of the perpetrators. And I think that it's quite different after that. Certainly by the 80s, and I think moving from there until today, the attitude is far more draconian. It's just the moral event horizon. You just do it, and that's it for you. I mean, you're a bad person now, and fate has it coming for you. And well, it should. Now, I can think of a few exceptions. There's actually a popular Netflix show that my family and I have watched recently in which this isn't the case, but to watch the popular reaction to that very thing is instructive. People cannot get over that, even though the characters themselves actually do. So anyway, that's something I notice in Anyone Got a Match. Certainly it matches, no pun intended, it fits with that picture that the people in the story, as well as the sort of amorphous agencies of the fiction, seem to recognize that this is something that a person can do. This is potential behavior. It's not good behavior, but it is certainly something people are capable actually of. So, interesting detail thereof. Boo in the story is certainly one of the less sympathetically treated characters. She isn't a bad person. She makes a few decisions or has a few opinions or perspectives that I don't think are presented. They're not presented sympathetically. One of the most sympathetic characters, considers her very stupid, and there doesn't seem to be much, to argue against that. However, she is extremely realistic about her circumstances at the end, and is, I think, kind of deserves a look. The story from the point of view of Boo. In a lot of ways, that's sort of left a little less interdimensional than most of the other characters. Let's see, with Virgil, strangely enough, who is, I think, set up very well as a full-on, leading man protagonist, right there next to Ira, right there next, in male counterpoint to Polly, kind of loses that. His high point being when he, brings the hammer down to make Acanthus a real university, with everything that applies, and you really get a look at his ideals, which are admirable and exciting. And after that, once the TV production takes over, Virgil kind of fades, and he only really exists at that point in terms of his relationship to Polly. And that is also weird and ties in with this whole infidelity thing. Okay, clearly, it is a peak moment of story decision making when he is offered, Polly flings herself at him, and he just doesn't want it, or more accurately, just certainly doesn't want it this way. He doesn't want her drinking herself into a stupor so that she can, do it. He doesn't want to be in this nasty place. He doesn't want it to be as basically a vile act. And ultimately goes from there, kind of grades from there into more of a romantic knight who wouldn't do it anyway. That's just not. He doesn't do such things. That right there, there's kind of a flip in the middle of that scene, or that really doesn't work, I think, with the rest of the story and the way that it treats humans. And for me, it also, at that time, I'm less interested in Virgil and his various decisions from that point forward, of which there are few. There really aren't any decisions from that point forward. He just kind of coasts through on the rest of the story and reaffirms that he always wanted to marry Boo. Even he says it's just by habit. So it's kind of a, well, not just by habit, but he certainly names the habit as a factor. Virgil kind of grays out at that point, and it's not surprising to me that it grays out when he, unlike everybody else, seems to treat infidelity as a completely black and white act. I certainly get it. I really get it in terms of him saying, not like this, which would imply that, well, Polly, if you'd have me under, sober, and, you want this and have wanted it like I've wanted it, then yeah. But there's no hint of that. That, I think, would have given credence and continued humanity for Virgil, and he wouldn't have had to have been kind of a faded out figure on a tapestry for the rest of the novel. There's also another interesting aspect of that, which is that Ira never tells Gabriel that he's his father, and there's this strong implication of, he must never know, I can never tell him. And I wonder why. I kind of wonder why. Why would you not tell Gabriel? Maybe not now when he's, 18 going on 13, clearly. But in the fullness of time, why ever not? So anyway, there's strange differences in the concept of infidelity, honor, heroism, stuff like that, that I find evident, and I can discover them when I examine my intuitive reactions to the story. Okay, so what's another interesting topic? Max Schulman is widely identified as not only just, an American author, child of immigrants, World War II veteran, humorist, and acclaimed contributor to television. He's also strongly identified as Jewish, and this shows up probably characteristically rarely as an explicit protagonism in the novels themselves. His earlier novels, which were mostly about returning veterans, the characters are often very Joe American and actually not even very New York. Very much kind of the GI, the cartoon. Read any issue of Stars and Stripes and look at the cartoons and look at the guys, and those are his protagonists. As his stories continue, I've read quite a lot of them actually, the characters become more like Ira and Polly, although nothing he writes before anyone got a match, reaches that level of humanity and recognition and just no holds barred, slap in the face of what Shulman thinks about America. Clearly he loves it very deeply, but is uncompromising in his critique of basically the lifestyle that he entered into. But in Anyone Got a Match, and I think it's very clear to anybody who's followed the story, and I also think that it's distinctive in terms of, I don't know if it's a sharp shift right there, but it's definitely a gradation, a strong, gradation from the previous work. Jewishness is present in the novel. As I mentioned, Miss Goldberg, the secretary, is a fine presence in the story. But there's also the commentary. Jefferson Tatum's interior life is haunted by Jews. He talks about who the Owenses might bring, or he thinks about whom the Owenses may bring to the lodge. And then there's that glorious line, though. I mean, just that remarkable line that fits entirely with the civil rights and racial issues that the book is about, if I may say so. It's about a lot of things. But when Tatum says to Ira, I like you, Shapian. I like almost all you Jew fellers. And Ira says, well, not that it makes any difference, but I'm Armenian. And Jefferson replies and it says, without missing a beat, just deadpan, you're right, it don't make any difference. Now, you want to talk about, is this the portrait of the young woman turning away, or is the portrait of the old woman turning toward you? I mean, you want to look at a scene in a novel that just hands you that double portrait and says, well, that is it. Is that a statement of outstanding prejudice? Just the most barefaced bigotry possible. Or, and I suspect that it is, given all the other events of the novel, within the logic of the novel itself. Okay, we're not talking about my personal agreement, but is it a statement of the most leveled lack of bigotry possible in the absence of dewy-eyed romanticism? If you want to be not a bigot, and this isn't about, embracing everybody and anybody and everybody loves each other and all the rest of it. It's not about that, but it is about anti-bigotry. Then you might say something like that. So it's quite a thing. And the sort of not particularly many Jewish characters, but the issue of Jewishness being a context in which everybody else's ethnicity is noted is strong in the novel. It's if one may say so, it isn't a novel about Jewish people, but it is a novel by a Jewish person. And that doesn't mean it conforms to any particular stereotype, even a presentation, although the American humorist tradition is very strong in there, the Jewish side of it, but just as strong would be Mark Twain, for example, or any number of other, American writers. So I wouldn't even say that its style is necessarily identifiable with some kind of textbook encyclopedic and definition of Jewish American humor. So I don't mean that kind of emphasis. What I mean is the person. That Shulman's humanity is self, which includes that background, is present. And given his love and mastery of language, which is just outstanding in the book, it's one of my favorite prose pieces ever. A man's crotch is his castle, for example. Well, much more wordplay than that, but that one does come to mind. I think that the novel is beautifully written and read in that context. So it took me a while to get that, actually. I didn't have any context for it as a kid. Still haven't told you the context of reading the novel in the first place, but I'll get there. By the way, it wasn't a Mongos, it was a Quadamundi. So there's that. But then what else? Here's the big one that I had in mind for today, which I'm rapidly, paddling myself away from talking about. So might be Friday Live 71 coming up for more of this. But if we look at the issue of food and food additives, boy, there's a lot going on with that. First, cigarettes, okay? 1964, and obviously the years leading up to it for the writing of the novel, that just seems really early to just be coming straight out on there and saying lung cancer. And especially when you realize that they were showing TV ads, gangbusters for cigarettes and paperback books like Anyone Got a Match. My copy doesn't, but I'm certain some of them did, had those inserts. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but you got a paperback book back then in the, all the way up into the 60s. And I knew it because, I had tons of these paperbacks and continued to buy them steadily through the 70s. But they came with these stiff paper inserts, and they were cigarette ads. So you're reading a novel, and there it is. There's a cigarette ad halfway through. It's the commercial in your book. So TV, of course, is riddled with them, with all manner, of the various Marlboro, of course, and Viceroys and whatnot. There was a big controversy at some point. I didn't experience it. I was too young, but I was just old enough to have it be a constant cultural reference in the early mid-70s. Some actress refused to appear in a show or refused some kind of participation that she was scheduled for because she didn't want, she refused to have cigarette ads during her shows. And I don't know what the legalities of it or whether it was contractual or anything, but it was kind of a big deal. It was like a celebrity, disavowal of cigarette advertising. Those of you who are familiar with Warren magazines may know that they had an anti-cigarette ad, an anti-cigarette piece that was disguised to look like an ad by Frank Frazetta, in fact, did the art. And it was, it meant Warren Magazine would have no cigarette revenue, no revenue from cigarette advertising, because he kept that in there, and that cost them a lot of money. And similarly, Warren Magazines was one of the first of pop culture to really come down in opposition to the Vietnam War in the mid-late 60s, before Walter Cronkite, I might add. And so Warren was who he was, but he definitely knew what he considered right and wrong. Definitely moral compass kind of guy. Well, anyway, so those were the contexts in which my childhood, my preteen childhood was thinking about cigarettes, was this kind of celebrity struggle over them, and cigarette ads were dropped from television. I don't remember ever actually seeing one, so it must have been some time between when I was about 1970, to about, I don't know, 8 or 10 or something like that. I'm not sure. Maybe it was earlier, but they got dropped there. But this book is well before that. I mean, well before that. And those are just like people kicking in the traces. So, I mean, it's pretty loud and proud. I mean, cigarettes, lung cancer, done. So in that context, what about the food? It's played for comedy, of course. The idea that Jefferson would say, I'm going to make everybody so scared of food, they'll think the safest thing they can put in their mouth is a cigarette. And that's silly in its way. As they point out in the book, it's actually a pretty good diversionary tactic. So it's not silly, it might be silly in content, but it's not silly as business. But what about the content in the book? Now, you may be interested to know that, first of all of the chemical content of the book is accurate. A lot of the additives that Dr. Clara Selenko fulminates against were actually dropped in the next 10 years. A lot of the practices were brought into question culturally over the next 10 years. And if she seems like a complete nut to you, bear in mind, first of all, that a lot of what she said was actually put into practice, and justifiably so. And also that certain of her errors, which, of course, when she says, when it comes to poison, no dose is acceptable. Well, okay, yeah, she's going over the line there. Lots of things are poisons at a certain dose and not poisons, and do other things that we want at lower doses. And so there's plenty of things like that. And so she is a bit bonkers here and there, but her mission is not as bonkers as it looks. Fascinatingly, even when it comes to water, and specifically fluoridation, Dr. Levine doesn't say anything stupid. Everything he talked about was actually a justifiable policy problem. He never talks about, crazy ass shit about our precious bodily fluids or anything mystical that'll happen. He never talks about conspiracies by the government to fluoridate us all or any of that stuff. It's actually all proper policy management concerns that he has about fluoridation, things that are a matter of policy and human protection. I mean, yes, encrustation is something one should concern oneself with. And then if you're going to decrust, then how? So all of these are relatively reasonable. The objections, interestingly enough, brought up by Andrew McAndrews, who clearly is, a professional. And interestingly enough, he actually doesn't provide strong arguments. He presents very good counterspin, but he doesn't, and he's very folksy about it, right? I mean, he's very, appealing about it. But I've examined his arguments with some care, and from the perspective of somebody who actually is trained in precisely these things, for your information. And he does not actually manage to rebut her. His rebuttal is TV effective. It is not scientifically very sound. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Today, we have seen a great deal of the concern for naturalism go deeply awry. And that has always had that has always been the case to an extent. But in the middle of the 20th century, when food technology and production, particularly born as it was in the Great Depression and during World War II, was very heavily focusing on bulk and flavoring. And the white bread criticism that she makes was actually accurate. That's not the case today for what we would call white bread. But yes, at the time in the early 60s, this stuff was basically, bleached sawdust. There wasn't anything in it. So the kind of, all natural versus, better living through chemistry sort of clash that they have plays differently nowadays. I'm not saying everything's all better, so the only people who object are nuts, but the degree of nuthood is frightening and heavily financed, heavily, it's funny, the people who are fulminating the most about conspiracy theories are actually the people who conform most to that particular stereotype in reality. So anyway, the book is therefore a bit of an artifact for this, a bit of a snapshot. It was written in the thick of, increased public critique over a genuine issue, and is, as I say, Shulman must have researched the hell out of it. He doesn't miss a beat on a single chemical. He doesn't drop any, he throws in no technobabble whatsoever. Every bit of that was like spot on. So it's pretty impressive to look at something, even though the issues aren't the same as they are today. It's cool to look at something that well researched and well presented, with the blind spots present as well, which I like. In the language of its day, and then you look at that and you say, oh, so this is what it looks like at that time. And you can say, and how does it look now? Do we have progress? On the average, yes, bread is far better for you now than it was then. True. Or what? One can hear Clara Selenko's thoughts. I can certainly hear what she'd say in my head in regard to the feeding of cattle, ground up remains and byproduct of their cohort that are left over, and then that gets mixed into their feed. And what that means for the proliferation of microbes, and then controlling that with antibiotics in massive doses. Interesting, she would say. I'm sure, it makes anything she says in the book, look pretty tame. So all manner of interesting, reflections certainly can occur, and also to examine the portions where she is bonkers. Also to examine whether and how, the FDA, which is the same agency that they talk about in the book, whether and how it's operated, and all viewpoints, certainly are brought up by reading the book, because it is a very accurate and intellectually sound snapshot of the way that the arguments stood then. And that then is not a fantasy universe with magical rules. It is our then. So well worth knowing. Okay, those are some of my thoughts about the book. I will talk a little bit more about how I came to read it next time. It won't take that long, I suppose, so we'll probably start new topics. Hooray! At that point. Hey, listen, if you like me reading to you, which I actually kind of like doing, I won't say that Friday Live's always going to be about that, but I might pick up another book sooner or later.